Welcome to Vox Rationis with me, Aditya Kashyap, and this is a podcast where we talk world issues from a student's perspective. As you might have noticed, we're back after a 2 month hiatus, and of course, that isn't without reason. Trish, we've been a bit busy, safe to say. Let's update the audience of what we've been up to. So first of all, I hope you've been doing some useful things, Trish. How about you talk about what's been going on with you over the last 2 months?
Yeah, for the last 2 months, I had to finally finish off my applications for college. Then I also had the mock to prepare for. And yeah, a lot of activities that come with it to do some preparations for. And I think you also did as well. I mean, you did a little more as well. You applied to the US as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, US and UK. But yeah, I mean, as exhausting as it is, it's good that it's finally coming to an end. Um, but what that does mean is that, especially since we're in our nice sort of winter holidays, it gives us time to think about things, doesn't it? And thinking is, of course, one way where you can get your brain, really up and running. And when you really consider these, especially politics nowadays, which of course it's one of the main topic of this podcast. I wanted to talk about a particular topic today, which I think it's very pertinent, and I think one which I feel like everybody to some extent has a view on, and that's political polarization. So, Trish, without going into a very concrete definition, do you see today's society being more polarized, especially in the political world?
Um, yeah, so I think this is something which I did include in some of my essays where I did say that in an increasingly polarized world, and I agree that what I said was a little, I mean, at that moment was a loose cannon saying a bit of that. But I think if you were to take a look at it, it does show that we are going towards a more divided society in terms of ideology. And you could call that polarization, but there are some countries that do also have more common footing or indifference towards politics in that sense. Like, I think a lot of people say the younger generation in the UK is actually moving towards indifference to politics. And I think in that sense, you could say political polarization is not something which is quite predominant. But there are many other countries, I mean, tons of other countries that do have this increasing polarization. And I do think, yes, overall, we are becoming more and more divided in that sense.
Yeah, I actually think you made one very interesting point, which I think I would actually say is possibly a symptom of polarization when you mentioned that younger people are becoming more and more indifferent towards politics. I read a stat the other day that said that more Americans, young Americans especially, are getting exhausted by talking about politics. And I don't think that exhaustion comes from things being all hunky dory, right? I think safe to say that there are some problems currently in today's politics, but so of course I think because I think it's always important we give some definitions to any topic which you want to discuss. So I pulled out my trusty AI definition. Of course, AI is becoming all the more popular, and I think this is actually a very good one. So bear with me, guys. So basically, political polarization, as defined by the one and only AI, is that it's when political attitudes move away from the center and more towards ideologically extreme positions. So basically, where a population, it increasingly sees, the positions of the people moving towards more coherent and having more different attitudes towards parties and party members. So what that means is that the average person is now going to have a more defined ideology, and you're more likely to see a person holding a stance which is more likely to be different from the other person, wherein there is less common ground, safe to say. I think that's the main symptom over here, is that there is less common ground and there's more infighting. So I think safe to say, fighting as per se, it does raise alarm bells. But I think when we talk about political polarization, Trish, um, my question is, of course, and a lot of people ask this question, is it isn't very unique to today's day and age. politics has been polarized for, as long as it's been, alive. So do you think there's anything particularly unique about today's polarization?
Um, yeah, so when you talk about today's political polarization, you have to also maybe consider like where we're talking about, I guess, because if you were to consider the US, I think a lot of people do say in the US that you have two center-right parties in that sense. And a lot of when people say that, I kind of do understand so that yeah, you said it's a shift away from the center. Yes, it has shifted away from center, but maybe here you're seeing that many parties, even in the US, both the predominant parties are taking more centrist stances or stances which suit their voters who happen to be slightly the average voter happens to be right of center. And I think in that sense, you could say that there is a polarization. I mean, there's not much polarization between these two parties, but you could also talk about the differences in ideologies between different, like between the far left and what you call maybe the center left, or what you may say as more people who are aligning with, let's say, ideologies of Biden, Clinton's, etc., like within the Democrat Party. So I think yeah, what polarization today also may seek to do is it may seek to make it more into a party line system. So voting is entirely based upon your political party and it's not based upon any uh, particular ideology in itself. And I think maybe that's a reason as to why people have, I mean, that's maybe a reason as to why parties have moved. I mean, I mean, even the, traditionally, they were left-wing party like the Democrats have moved to right of center. And I think, yeah, but I could also, you could also, one could also say that one thing unique is both parties are going towards more centrist ideologies or ideologies that do adopt voters from the other side of the party. So I think maybe this is something which they may do if it's a really close election or it's a really close election, which is quite likely in a polarized system. And they may adopt more centrist policies. So I think this is a self-rectifying system of polarization, which could happen. So I think that's kind of interesting
Hmm.
today's time.
Yeah, I think you make some good points. I actually think so first thing is I think it's important we kind of understand like what actually happens in a polarized society. So I pulled up a few points over here. And I think the first thing is that, when we talk about a very polarized society, oftentimes it means that, especially relating to social issues, you're often going to have two very neatly divided and very coherent stances on it, where more often than not, the average person is going to be lying on either of those two stances, and there's very little. There are very few people who are willing to kind of say that, like, I think there's a bit of nuance here and there, like that. I think, especially in today's day and age, I think what's actually happening is that fewer people are willing to take that, like you mentioned, that center left and center right. I think interesting that you mentioned that, that you just mentioned the Democrats moving more to the right, at least to the center. I actually feel like, when you take the Republicans, for instance, and I don't want this to be a discussion about necessarily about politics, but when you look at figures like Vivek Ramaswamy, for instance, who, regardless of whether he's going to win the nomination or not, the current fervor and in the Republican Party, at least, is a one of anti-establishment, basically, where, voters, at least on their side, they tend to be very frustrated against the traditional party, ideologies, the traditional center right stances. So, for instance, like, uh, what I would probably say against, support for Ukraine. Let's take that for instance. That was one particular issue which both Republicans and Democrats, at least until, probably even the early 2023, both sides of the aisle were, in consensus that they had to be funding Ukraine. I think there's less consensus now, and in fact, you can see that by the House of Representatives kind of stalling aid for Ukraine. So what I'm kind of seeing right now is actually that because of this polarization, it means that now people are increasingly taking more and more, divided stances on issues, where you're going to have on any particular issue, it's going to be people having two very, very neatly divided stances. And I think, of course, there isn't anything inherently wrong with it. I think that's something we need to preface with saying, okay. But the issue, I think, what happens is that when you live in a very polarized society, what often happens is that engaging in dialogue and engaging in any type of discourse, it often becomes a lot more hostile than what it would normally be. Because it would often mean that it's my side versus your side. And that's where we get the word tribalism, where it's my tribe versus your tribe. And every single issue or any type of debate which happens, more and more it becomes about proving that my side is better than yours, rather than actually saying, okay, let me listen to your side compassionately and let me try and see if we can find some common ground, because common ground is, it's an essential part of especially parliamentary democracies, where you're going to increasingly have coalition governments. This is of course away from Republican and Democrat politics in the US, but compromise is essential in parliamentary democracy, where oftentimes both sides, you're not going to quite get what you want, um, and more often than not, you're going to have to compromise somewhere. But increasingly, when you have voters who tend to take more polarized stances, like for instance, when we take the Netherlands, where right now they're trying to make a coalition government with the Populist Party, the PVV, that's currently being stalled because the parties are taking widely different stances on social issues, on immigration. That means that you're not going to have that stability that you would ideally want. And I think most people would agree that you want to have a stable government, stable politics. So I think those are some problems that can arise from a polarized society. And I think that there is a worldwide trend right now that's indicating that politics is becoming more polarized. It's not just us saying it for the sake of it. It is actually happening in real time. So, do you have anything to add, Trish, about this?
Yeah, I think when you talk about especially this us versus them ideology, the tribalism concept, or yeah, I mean, it's not just from a political sense, it's also in society, we can talk about a religious sense as well. It's being brought up where, or even in terms of immigration, a lot of people say, especially I think in Europe, this is happening where they say anti-immigration. I think even in the US as well. I mean, the US may be more traditional, but uh, it's quite largely growing recently in Europe, where anti-immigration based upon especially immigrants from, I think, Middle East and other countries like Syria, especially, they are people from, I mean, the citizens are very frustrated against parties that allow, that don't restrict this immigration. And I think, yeah, I think that is something which also is us versus them actually, which creates, and maybe that could also be a symptom of political polarization in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, and we can name a few issues which are increasingly the source of a lot of polarization. Immigration. I think immigration actually has become almost, at least in Europe, at least, because I think immigration, even in the US, it has seen, but I think more and more we're seeing in Europe, because the example I mentioned, the PVV in the Netherlands, he ran on a very anti-immigration, anti-Islam type of a thing, and of course we don't want to necessarily endorse or reject anything, but that's simply what happened over there. And I think other issues in the US, abortion is one type of an issue which is increasingly the source of a lot of polarization. Ukraine, and I think more actually probably a more relevant issue is actually the Israeli Gaza war. It's another source of polarization, and all of these things kind of intertwine into like you mentioned, the immigrants versus the quote unquote the native people, like that. You're going to constantly be having these tribalistic attitudes, where you're basically saying that, okay, these are the people who are the source of all problem in this country, like that. And I think you know most people don't want to live in a country or in a society where you're constantly having to fight, you're constantly having to battle to pass your bills and pass, just go about your life. I think nobody wants to live a very turbulent life like that. So I think it's something that needs to change. But what are some ways in which we could improve polarization, Trish? Because I think, and this is obviously easier said than done. Of course, we're just two teenagers, but I think it's worth discussing at least, because this is something which we really need to think about. How do we address this political polarization? So do you have any ideas?
So I mean, when you talk about improved polarization, I mean, it's kind of like reducing, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think in that sense, but I mean, maybe we have to also think about whether this polarization is it inevitable in the first place. So
Mm.
if you were to take a look at it, maybe that you have certain ideologies like who benefits of this polarization, and some politicians tend to benefit as well. When you have more, as I said, like when you have these strong party line voters, they do tend to benefit from this polarization, and they'll try their best to propagate or further it. And I would say that perhaps it does seem quite, in that sense, quite inevitable to occur because you're always going to have some form of disagreement. And some people, if they have power to benefit of that disagreement, they'll try to further it. And I think that is something which has happened over time. And I think, yes, you may say we give different terms like political polarization. Some may call it a class divide. Some people may call it anti-Semitism or anti-Islam. You have different forms of it. And I think overall, such this form of ghettos of one idea versus another idea, I think that's something which has happened throughout history, and maybe it does look kind of something which is inevitable. So I think the best what we tend to do is how we counter it is mostly saying that, I mean, is something they say like completely abolish politics, everyone's indifferent to politics. I guess maybe in such a sense, people are always going to find other issues to be divided on, like whether, and they may start calling that political issues. So I think, yes, overall, how do we, I think it's not something which we can actually get rid of permanently, but we can reduce it to an extent. And I think, yeah, whenever you have multiple parties in a country, that is something which perhaps may ensure that political parties are more reliant on coalition governments. And whenever you have coalition governments, it does give you that feeling, I think, mentally as well, that you have different ideologies at the table, so the diversity of it's not a polarized system, it's more diverse, and therefore you have a chance for common ground. But more chance for compromise. And I think in such a system, but also there are some issues as well, because even in multi party countries, you do have some parties that just take an absolute majorities. And I think it does not interfere. I mean, but I think maybe when you have multiple parties or multiple parties agree, I think that is perhaps the best solution. It's not an overall solution, of course, but I think it is perhaps the better one towards working.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it's pretty. Yeah, I think you've raised some good points, especially given that you kind of have to think about, because it's like political polarization but it isn't like a movement of any sort. It's more like something. It's an effect that we all observe, and I think, like, to some extent, I actually do agree that it is in somewhat inevitable, and like we have seen political polarization across the world. But I also think that what actually we there are a few things which we can do, and I think the biggest thing, and it's probably the simplest thing, but it also for some people is the hardest thing, is actually just talking. Talking, engaging in conversations which we may be uncomfortable with having, engaging in debates like these. I wouldn't say this is necessarily a debate, but engaging in conversations with people who we don't necessarily share the same views with. I think that's one of the biggest things, and I think it's probably the biggest thing which we need to be doing right now, especially as young people, because I wouldn't like to throw young people under the bus, especially since I'm a young person. But since young people are impressionable, we tend to we at least in my opinion, we tend to sort of move towards our comfort ideologies, and I actually, yeah, I would correct myself by saying most people anyway. It's a cognitive bias rather. So I think, you know, engaging in debates, engaging in dialogues with people who we don't share the same ideology with, we don't share necessarily the same views, more because, just hearing them out, because I think the thing is, whenever you have this us versus them attitude, you're more at risk to actually misunderstanding the other side more than anything. And once you get a more comprehensive understanding of the other side, I feel like more often than not, you're either going to come a wiser person, or at least you're gonna have a more comprehensive view of what you believe, because a lot of people just tend to believe things without actually knowing why they believe it. You know what I mean? They, for instance, someone may say that they're against abortion. Let's just take that as an example. But why are they against abortion? It's not as clear. It's more like some politician may be just parroting it, 24 times a day, and they may be just, it may just absorb into their heads. But why do they? Because because I always feel like, and it's a very idealistic thing. I always feel like the best way to approach politics is approaching it by your own principles. Everybody has their own set of principles. And these they come from different places. But if you approach politics and you approach political leaders, especially through your own set of principles, then you're more likely to be less hypocritical, and you're likely to see every issue with a bit more nuance than what you'd normally see. And I think the real reason why I think political polarization more than ever, why we need to have this conversation, is because, like, these sort of things, like what you mentioned, especially since, like, having more parties, for instance, with more political parties, I feel like the diversity of thought, that really, it starts to become a real thing. And I think more and more countries, especially those who are sort of locked in this two-party system, especially like in the US, um, we tend to see that once there are, especially when there are more parties, like for instance, there are debating points of views, but I think when you have a balance of parties who represent different ideas and oftentimes different stances, represent different identities, you're more likely to see people aligning themselves with parties, and it often is relatively fluid. But I think that is one solution, like you mentioned, where people become less frustrated about politics in general. So that being said, I think it's a pretty good discussion that we had today about political polarization. Do you have any final thoughts, Trish? Um,
Yeah. So this is like it's quite a interesting topic. It's quite big. You can apply it to different scenarios. But I think yeah, working out the most important thing is to start from the base logically, step by step, break it down what exactly does it mean, and hopefully try understanding what are the consequences of it and whether it's actually a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think a lot of us would say yes, it is a bad thing. And I think yeah, that's perhaps why this topic is so interesting because it is quite rooted towards step by step process.
And as always, I think at the end of the day, we're trying to have these kinds of conversations where we talk about these issues which are relatively pressing. And I think political polarization is one where I feel like it's almost like the basis of this entire podcast, where a lot of our episodes have been on very controversial topics, and at times we've presented different sides of the issue. I may come with one stance and you may come with another. But at the end of the day, since we're hearing each other out in a relatively, I would say probably a more mellow and, quite a calm fashion, I think we are coming out, knowing more than we did when we entered. So, hope you guys enjoy the episode as always. We'll be trying to upload a bit more regularly, but of course, given that we're nearing the end of our schooling, we're going to be having more and more exams. I think it's safe to say that we're in for some busy times, but I think probably this will remain an activity which we'll be having whenever we feel like we have some time, and it's pretty fun. I would probably say, right, talking about things that are relatively vague and ambiguous. So hope you guys enjoyed it, and as always, like and subscribe to the podcast, and follow our Instagram account as well, Vox Rationis. And that's it from us. Thank you, guys.